Hello, everybody, and we're going to start. If we could have your attention, conversations maybe go somewhere else so we can hear everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Jon Platt, and I can see on my screen here, I can't see what I'm seeing, so I'll have to do it this way. Sorry for the confusion here. So I'm a contester, and I've been contesting for quite a while. What you see on the screen there is a picture of me from 1991, the September VHF contest, roving with my friend Rich and 0HJZ. Thank you. Thank you. And we were out somewhere in EN23 with my Volkswagen van that I loved and I hated to sell. And by the way, if you have any questions later on about anything, you can contact me, w0zq@aol.com. I'm also a member and president of the Northern Lights Radio Society, so you can find me there. You can see our emblem up there, top left. But that was Rich operating. We were operating on 6.2, 222, 432, and 1296. Again, somewhere out there in the cornfields of EN23, west of the Twin Cities. Having a lot of fun. We would set up that mast. It's 20 feet of Radio Shack mast that we would put up with some short boom Yagis on the bands. A little hard to see, but at the very bottom, underneath the longer 2-meter antenna, there's a dipole for 6 meters, and that's typically what we would use on 6 meters. Again, circa 1991, so 32 years ago. Getting old. So this presentation is about basic VHF contesting. Is a topic I could talk about for a long time. You don't want to hear me talk a long time. So this is kind of VHF 101, if you'd like, with a couple tips here and there along the way. So it's really intended to be, you know, how to get into VHF contesting and why and what's so fun about it. The primary VHF contests kind of in 2 slots. There's actually 3. The ARRL sponsors a number of contests. CQ Worldwide has one. And then there's some, you know, other ones like Central States VHF Society has a spring and fall sprints contests. So there's many contests throughout the year on VHF that you can play in and have fun. The big ones from the ARRL perspective are the January, the June, and the September contests. And those are 6 meters and up. Those are very popular contests, lots of people to work. There's also what's now called the 222 megahertz and up DX challenge, which used to be the old UHF contest for those who might have been familiar with that. One of the interesting things about this contest is that the scoring system is different. It's actually an accumulative contest where you get to count to the number of kilometers that you work between stations. So that's why it's called the DX challenge. It's kind of an interesting concept and a lot of fun. Again, 222 and up. There's a 10 gig contest, which also uses that same concept for scoring. It's distance-based, 1 point per kilometer when working stations. Stations can move 10 miles and you can work them again. Common distances worked on that band are anywhere from a couple hundred kilometers to 400 or 500 kilometers, particularly with some rain scatter. A lot of fun. I've got a 10 gig small system at our club table if you want to stop by and take a look at it on 10 gigs. That takes place in August. And then there's EME contests that take place in the fall on bands from 1296 and up, or excuse me, 6 meters and up. It's actually 6 meters and up. They have different weekends for different bands. So those who enjoy EME are often focus activity on those contests. Then the other big contest is in July, is the CQ Worldwide VHF. The interesting thing about this contest is that it's 6 and 2 meters only. So you don't necessarily have to have all those other bands that some of the other people have to get on and be competitive and have fun. And it's been very popular. And by the way, it is worldwide. So, you know, if there's some DX on 6 meters, you can work some DX as well. General contest entry categories. So this is kind of a general concept. It's not specific to any one contest. There's generally 3 different operating categories that you can compete in. You can be a single operator, like a home station. You can be a multi-operator, again, a home station, a fixed location where maybe you and your club or your friends get together and operate, or as a rover. And we'll talk a little bit about rovers down the line here. But rovers are people who pack things like in the first slide I showed you and go out and operate from various locations, and we'll get into that in a minute. Back to single operators, there's essentially nowadays 2 entry categories. There's what we call analog only or all mode. As most of you probably know, with the rise of FT8, there's been a lot of chatter about the desire and the fun of using digital modes on any band, let alone VHF. And so what has been created is another category for those who don't want to fool around with a computer. They don't want to mess around with digital. They just want to operate sideband, CW, and maybe FM. And if you do that, you would enter as an analog only category. And so that allows you to compete with other like-minded, like-equipped stations. Or you can operate on all modes, including not only sideband and CW, but also FT8 or maybe one of the other digital modes, in which case you would be all mode. So there's two categories nowadays quite often. There's high power, there's low power. There's a 3-band category, which includes 6.2 and 432. So again, you know, if you don't have a shack full of equipment and you still want to be competitive and play in a contest, there's a couple of different categories for you, including the 3-band. And there's a QRP portable, which is kind of a fun category. Allows you to take your 10 or 50-watt rig out with small antennas and do some portable work, maybe on a high hill and put on some rare grids. And then finally, there's an FM only category for those who operate only FM. In the multi-operator category, we have a limited and unlimited category. Limited are just the lower 4 bands, 6.2, 222, 432. Unlimited is all the bands you can compete with. And then finally, Rover. Again, there's a limited category with rovers, 6.2, 222, 432. So, you know, if you want to go out and do some roving and be competitive and have some fun, you don't necessarily have to load up your rover with, you know, lots and lots of bands. A lot of the radios nowadays have at least 2 or 3 of those bands. You can go out and have some fun. What we refer to as classic roving is unlimited. It's multiple bands, including 6 through whatever you've got. And then for rovers, you can have 1 or 2 operators with you. So quite often operators will take someone along with them, and there'll be 2 guys having some fun, kind of like you saw in my earlier photo. And one thing I want to stress is always read the rules. You know, all the contests are different. You think you know them and they go and change them. So first thing you do before any contest is you read the rules. That applies to all contests. Okay. Maidenheads. Does everyone knows what a maidenhead grid is, right? Is anyone not familiar with maidenhead grids? Okay. Yeah, they've been around a long time. They're used in many contests now. And the contest exchange for most of, not all these contests, is your maidenhead. I think we're here in, is this EN 35? I suspect we're in 35 now. I live in EN 34. The interesting thing, I don't know if everyone knows, is that those maidenheads can be further subdivided into what they refer to as subgrids. So they use the same concept of dividing down the grids. So for instance, my home station is an EN 34 IT. The IT designates even a smaller area. And when you get into some of the microwave contests where you're using distance for scoring, knowing a precise location helps with that. Here's some common VHF scoring methods that you'll find. Typically, it's total QSO points times the total number of grids, maidenhead grids. We just call them grids. Sometimes they're called multipliers for obvious reasons. And QSO points increase with frequency. So if I make a contact on, say, 6 meters, that might be 1 point. If I make a contact on 432, a higher frequency, that might be worth 2 or 4 points. And as an example, I gave a simple example there. If I made some contacts on 6, some on 2, some on 432, and all those different grids, you can see the little formula that you work up to come up with 765 points. And so the important thing to know here is that it's QSO points. QSO points go up with higher frequencies. That's why a lot of people like to add higher bands to their fixed station or the rovers. And grids are important as their multipliers. And that's one reason why we like looking for all the rovers, because they go to the rare grids. Rover scoring is a little different. I won't spend a lot of time on that. Read the rules. And they differ by the contest. CQ Worldwide is a little different than the ARRL contest, but it's basically the same concept in terms of total points times the number of unique grids. Yes. Yes, because 2 meters is 1 point. So 6 and 2 are 1 point. 222 and 432 are 2 points in this example. So the question was, why does 2 meters show up as only 1 point in the formula?
Yeah, we are, just a quick thing. We are recording this, so if you have a question, flag me down, bring a mic to you.
Thanks. Got to remember that. Hard to remember. Continuing on with basics, VHF contesting basics. One of the questions that when you're setting up to play in VHF contesting is whether you want to use a computer or not. And, what do you use a computer for? Well, you use it for logging. The common logging software programs, N1MM, Right Log, Rover Log, and 3FJP, they all do VHF contests. You click on, you pull it up, and you click on the contest, and you enter a couple of information about what your station is and where you're at, and away you go. You enter contacts in the log as you go, and at the end of the day, it generates a Cabarlo file that you can then send into the league or to CQ Worldwide to have your score submitted. Easy peasy, they work well. They've been around for a while. If you're going to be doing any digital work, you're going to need a computer of some kind in some way, typically a PC. And typically people are using WSJT-X for like FT4, FT8, even some of the more esoteric modes that will show up from time to time on VHF, like Q65, which are very weak. VHF, this is weak signal VHF contesting for the most part. And I don't know if everyone knows, but WSJT stands for weak signal Joe Taylor, K1JT. He's one of the authors. So WS is weak signal. And what are we? We're weak signal. So this particular tool is very useful for really working really weak guys. So let's talk a little bit about what might be some very basic equipment and setups for running VHF contests. For instance, on 6 meters, 100 watts works great. Well, obviously, more is better. Sometimes in the VHF community, we refer to power as goo. We always say more goo is better than less goo. So, power is always good, but there's nothing wrong with 50 or 100 watts. It will work well. When you start to look at the entry categories for these contests, there's the single op low power, SLOP, that's what that stands for, or single op high power, and there'll be a cutoff mark. So just be aware of where those are, depending upon what category you want to enter. Typically, it's 200 watts or less to be single op low power. Simple antennas on 6 meters work well. A Moxon, 3-element Yagis, try to get them up at least 25 feet or high. You don't have to have a monster station to have fun on 6 meters, as we know. Homebrew antennas on 6 work well. 6 meters is a great band for homebrewing antennas because dimensions aren't overly critical, and yet they're still fairly small to handle. It's not like putting up a 40-meter Yagi. Coax RG8 works fine. Keep runs short as you can, but don't be afraid of RG8 on 6 meters. LMR 400, of course, is a little better. So if you can afford that, or if you've got that, use LMR 400. And 6 meters is the most difficult band for rovers, and it's just due to physics. This is a whole nother topic, couldn't do another presentation on, but basically it's height above ground. All these antennas are horizontally polarized, and everything you know about horizontal antennas on HF apply to VHF as well. And on 6 meters, it's called 6 meters because that's the wavelength. And so a wavelength on 6 meters is about 19 feet. So if you can get an antenna up 19 feet, that's one wavelength up. That's kind of equivalent to having a 20-meter Yagi at, say, 60 feet, okay? It's all about physics and wavelength. And the advantage of getting the antenna higher up is that you get that takeoff angle that the RF is launching from the antenna down. And, as a VHF person trying to work stations a long ways away, you don't want your RF going up here unless you're working satellites. You want your RF going that way. So 6 meters is the most difficult band for rovers. 2 meters, more 2-meter basics. Again, 50 to 100 watts, more is better. Small boom, 10 to 12 feet booms. Longer is more gain, obviously, but longer also means a little sharper, a little harder to point, a little bit bigger mechanically. Homebrew antennas still work good. There's a place on Google called Cheap Yagi. If you Google that and pull it up, he has some really good homebrew antennas that you can build for 2 meters and up for the higher bands. They work very well. Go to Menards and buy the material, and you can be on these bands with a fairly effective antenna for $20, $30, $40, albeit you have to apply elbow grease. Again, as high as possible for your antenna. Trees start to, foliage starts to cause interaction with these VHF higher frequencies, but not too bad on 2 meters. Recommend LMR 400. And rovers, 2 meters is an important band because a lot of the coordination and finding each other happens on 2 meters. And so if you do roving, consider trying to find a way to be as loud as possible on 2 meters, which means as high as possible, as much power as possible, and as big antenna as possible. 432, 222 and 432, I kind of grouped these together. Again, kind of the same thing, just moving up the bands, 50 to 100 watts. More is better. Again, the same kind of consideration for antennas. Longer is more gain, but again, they're a little sharper. Trees start to cause significant blockage, especially at 432. So if you're a rover or if you have a home station, if you can find a location where you're not shooting through so many trees, that's helpful. LMR 400 is recommended, or if you have a home station, if you can spend the money to get some 7/8 inch Andrew Heliax, or even the 3/4 inch CATV, which by the way is 75 ohms, but that's a different topic. It still works well. But the 3/4 inch cable TV stuff works pretty well. That's what I use on some of these bands myself for my home station. And 222, 432 are actually some of the best bands for roving, again, due to physics. It's, you know, you can get a lot of gain with small antennas. The frequency is high enough where your takeoff angle, even at 8 or 10 or 12 feet above ground, is low. So it's not uncommon to be working rovers, and they'll often have a better signal on 222 or 432 than they do on 2 meters because of that. So it's a great band for rovers, again, due to physics, which again is a whole nother presentation. And then for the microwave bands, which are the 902, 1296 and up, there are bands above that. I didn't go into that for this presentation, but they typically are running anywhere from 10 watts to maybe 40, 50 watts. Some of the transverters will run 50, 60 watts. More is better. Trees start to cause significant blockage. And when you start to get into 902, 1296, and even 2304, these are what sometimes we refer to as the looper bands. I have a little picture there of a loop antenna. They kind of look like a quad. You can, obvious reasons they call a loop because they look like loops, right? But they're basically a full wavelength. So they're essentially kind of like a quad, if you're familiar with those on HF. And they work very well. When you get above, say, 2304, that's typically the realm of dishes. We start getting into using dishes on those bands. So some rover basics. One of the things about rovers that makes it so fun is, as a rover, you can be reworked when you enter a new grid. So W0ZQ/R, I'm a rover. I'm down in EN34, and I work fill in EN34, and then I drive up to EN35. I can work fill again. Now from EN35, and not only that, but Phil gets 2 multipliers, EN34 and EN35. And depending upon the contest, as a rover, I might get 2 multipliers too. So there's an advantage to finding rovers and to working rovers. As I mentioned there, fixed stations seek rovers because they're often in rare grids. There are not a lot of people out in EN24 on 222 or 432, for an example. So, you know, being able to find a rover out there with those bands really helps my score as a fixed station. Hence, you know, it's like being DX. You know, you're sought after. Again, I mentioned is try to be as loud as you can on 2 meters. Limited rovers are just 6 through 432. If you just want to play on those bands with some limited equipment, you can still compete as a limited rover. Antennas, as we talked about already, short boom Yagis. You can do everything as simple as a painter poles. I've seen people rovers using a painter poles like a portable setup, and they'll go out and put on 1 or 2 grids, or more complex, of which we have out in the parking lot. There's a couple of rovers out there you can go out and see, you know, car trucks mounted antennas with rotors and longer antennas. One of the things I want to stress, if you are a rover, make your rover plans known. I mean, if you go out to Timbuktu and you don't tell anyone you're going to Timbuktu, it's going to be hard for them to find you. So I've got some tips for how to do that in a minute here. Coordination. So, you know, depending upon the contest, again, read the rules. The ARRL contest lets you use your cell phone. So I can call Phil up and say, hey, Phil, I just moved to Timbuktu. Point your antenna this way. I'd like to work you. And then I have to hang up the phone. So no contest communications can go through the phone, but I can let him know where I am. And please point your antennas at me. CQ Worldwide does not allow that at this time. They're VHF contest. So no cell phones for CQ Worldwide. And then again, as I mentioned, we do have a rover road demo, W9FZ, KA9VVQ, myself, and I don't know if there's a third rover out there or not. Brought our rovers and there's demo, and that should be 12:30. It's not 12 noon. We're going to do it at 12:30. And again, after the final technical programs are done, sometime around 3:50, I think. So you put everything together, whether it's a rover or a fixed station. How do I know it's working? Well, you can get on call CQ. That's a good way to try it. Another thing you can do is you can look for our local beacons. There are beacons on 6, 2, 222, and 432, as you can see per this list, that are local. Dave N0KP has 3 beacons running right now, one each on 6, 2, and 432. I have a beacon running on 222. And these are local beacons that run, anywhere from 1 to 10 watts with Omni antennas that you should be able to hear if you're living anywhere close to the Twin Cities area. And we have a full beacon list, this along with all the other beacons that are more regional or out of state, at our club website that's listed there, nlrs.club. There's a link to a PDF that has all the beacons. Very helpful for knowing that your stuff is actually working. So let's talk about operating. Okay, first thing about operating is if you want to get into VHF contesting is join a club. There are 2 clubs locally here that I'm aware of that specialize in weak signal. Obviously, clubs like Minnesota Wireless Association also submit club scores, but for the most part, the clubs in this area that specialize in weak signal VHF and contesting are the Northern Lights Radio Society, NLRS, which you saw before. It's .club to get to that website. Very easy to join. If you have any questions, drop me a note. And the other one is the Chippewa Valley VHF contesters. They're across the what I call the Cheddar Line over in Wisconsin somewhere. And they're a smaller club, but very active as well. So if you're in Wisconsin or maybe Washington County or something, you might consider looking them up and seeing what they also have a website. So why do you want to join a club? Well, we have an email reflector. And we use the email reflector to share knowledge. Someone has a question about a transverter, or maybe they can't find a part, or they're going to go operating somewhere and they're looking for an antenna. All that kind of stuff gets communicated. Excuse me, on our website. Excuse me, on our email reflector. Along with, you often see quite a bit of chatter starting to increase just ahead of the big contest that I showed you earlier. June contests, rovers start to talk about where they might be going, what grids they're going to activate. There's also some links to rover plans, and we do have a spotting page too. So when the contest is running, you can actually post, W0ZQ is an EN24, he's on 144.220 right now. We also have club members with lots of test equipment and knowledge and resources. If you put together that 432 transverter, or you just bought a 2-meter rig and you aren't getting output, we have capabilities to help you try to figure out what's going on. And then we also help with borrowing equipment. I have extra antennas. I have some extra equipment. Sometimes we'll loan it out, particularly if a rover's going to that rare grid. You go into it, EN24 and 222, here, take this. Operating, more operating. So during the contest, whether you're a rover or a fixed station, contacts are usually started on 6 or 2 meters. And then stations basically QSY up to higher bands if they have them. So it's not uncommon to work someone on, say, 2 meters, and they'll say, do you have 432? Yeah, I got 432. Okay, let's go to 432 100. Okay, QSY. If you are doing that QSY, just drag your feet a little bit. Sometimes people will tail in, someone who's listening and hear you. Don't just jump real quick, give it 5 seconds and then move your frequency just to make sure that you try to catch those people who might be tail ending. The other thing on VHF contest is that there's only 1 contact allowed per band, regardless of mode. So if I work you on sideband on 2 meters, that's it. I can't work you on digital on 2 meters or on FM. So it's 1 contact per band, regardless of mode. And as far as operating goes on the bands, 6 meters CW, which has been waning, but has come back a little bit lately, can be found on the CW segment of the 6 meter band, which is 50 and 100 down. Phone is typically 50.125, that's the watering hole, and up as the band opens with sporadic E or some other opportunities. The digital modes are pretty much as it says there, and are the canned frequencies that appear in WSJT when you go to, say, 6 meters FT8. 50.313 will typically pop up. Then look for activity on both digital and analog modes. Now that there's a new analog category, there are people who don't do digital and they don't want to do digital, which is great. And so if you're up hanging on digital all day long, you'll never work those guys. So the only way to work them is to tune down there and call CQ a couple times or look around. So spend your time both on digital and analog is my recommendation. Understand 6 meter propagation. Again, a whole nother presentation. I think Don is doing a presentation on 6 meters. Fantastic band. It's the crossroads between HF and VHF. Aurora, Sporadic E, F2, even some Tropo, all sorts of propagation goes on 6 meters. Fantastic band. And in a contest, work 6 meters when it's open. When 6 meters is cooking, that's where you want to be. You know, you want to fish where the fish are, I think is what someone once said. Operating 2 meters, CW and phone contacts are typically centered on 144-200. That's the watering hole for 2 meters, plus or minus some. People sometimes QSY up or down a little bit. Again, the digital modes are as programmed in the WSJT. And propagation for Tropo is typically better in the morning hours and then later in the evenings. And there are other modes that are possible for anywhere from meteor scatter, again, in a whole nother different presentation, to Aurora, and again, a very popular VHF band. 222 and up, usually contacts during a contest appear there because you QSY'd from 6 or 2 meters, you QSY'd up. And there's the watering holes as I have them listed. Again, they're typically .100. And the digital are again as WSJT. And there is digital activity on those, by the way, during the contest. So more about operating as I mentioned earlier, the VHF ARRL VHF contest rules do allow the use of spotting networks. You can set up queues on chatting pages, like the particular one we use here is the Upper Midwest spotting page, which you can find a link to on our website, NLRS. And you can, as I mentioned earlier, use your cell phone to try to coordinate contacts and let them know that you're on or that you've moved or that you're looking for a contact. VHF rules, as I mentioned, are a little bit different. No cell phones. Again, read the rules. More operating, track the rovers. So if you want to have fun, if you want to have a good score, if you want to generate a lot of activity, trick number 1 is to track the rovers in your region for new queues and contacts and new grids. The rovers will typically put out a schedule. Rovers are not, required to hang to their schedule, but having the schedule published helps them and helps the fixed stations. So it's beneficial for all sides. But sometimes stuff happens. You get a flat tire. Sometimes propagation's good, and you decide not to move, whatever, and that's just fine. But the trick here and the thing to know is that there's rovers out in typically what areas they might be at and about what time. As we mentioned, run 6 meters sideband when it's open. Don't hang out. If you got an FT8 signal and it's 20 over S9, what are you doing on FT8? Does anyone have an answer for that? I was hoping I'd hear an answer. Go down to sideband. You can make contacts. It takes, what is it, a minute and a half to make an FT8 contact. You can make sideband contacts in 15 seconds, 12 seconds. So if you're and then run 6 meter SSB when it's open. As I mentioned, when you're on FT8, you're losing. When signals get weak, check out CW. If you like CW, if you're not a CW guy, go back to digital. That's fine. And then as the rates drop out, go back to FT8. The other thing is learn if you set up a station, how to run FT8 both on 6 and 2 at the same time. This sounds like some software stuff, which is not my forte, but you can do it. Depends upon the contest. Again, read the rules, but you can simultaneously call CQ on different bands in the ARRL contest. So for instance, I can be calling CQ on FT8 on 6 and 2 meters at the same time. So you can be actually running, two parallel stations at one time. CQ worldwide is a little different, so read the rules. And meteor scatter is another propagation mode, particularly 6 and 2 meters is very popular in the evenings. MSK 144. That's on one of the digital modes in WSJT, MSK 144. It's used for meteor scatter. And again, that's something that, you can expand your VHF contesting horizons in as you learn more and more about how to play in VHF contesting. So through the years, the evolution, WSJT came out in September of 2017, and with it, the FT8 and the FT8 discussions that have kind of caused some changes in some of the rules and some of the hard feelings on VHF contesting. In that people just kind of hang on FT8 and never go back to sideband at any time. And so as you can see here, some of the challenges that have evolved and we continue to look at and work on is stations tend to stay on 6 meters despite conditions. We've already talked about that. Casual stations not in the North America VHF contest mode. So that's another thing. In WSJT, I don't know if everyone knows it, but if you enter a VHF contest, you have to go to setup, and then I think it's advanced. and there's a box that you click and it will say NA contest mode, I believe. And what that does is when you make a contact on FT8 or any of the other digital modes, but FT8, instead of sending those, as someone calls them, the funny little numbers, you know, like your -8 or -12 or +2 or whatever, it sends your grid. And the contest exchange is your grid. So what happens sometimes is you're in a contest, I'm in contest mode, and I send EN34 to you and you send me -8. Well, that doesn't work. So I send an EN34 back to you and you send me -8. And so that causes some confusion and things to not move as forward as they could be. So make sure you're in contest mode. I've actually done that a couple times where I've forgotten. Oh, got to switch. Some of the software programs, I think it's there's one, JTDX, which is an FT8 app, not WSJT. Doesn't have a recognized contest mode. So if you're using FT8, if you're a JTDX user, just be aware that you might have to switch to WSJT because it doesn't send grids. And then, QSYing, that's the other difficulty. So if I work you on 2 meters FT8, and I know that you have 432, how do I tell you to QSY to 432 now? You know, when you're running sideband or CW, you could just say QSY at 4, you got 432? Yeah. Okay, I'll see you on 432, 110. Okay, see you there. You know, you could go back and now try doing that with FT8. So there is a free text message field, the TX5 menu in the lower right-hand corner, and you can put in a message there such as QSY 432.1, and people are doing that more and more now who have those bands in which to QSY, just to make you aware of that additional aspect to running digital on VHF contesting. So some tips: have your 6-digit grid locator program around. So if you have some narrow beam antennas, you know where to point. There's various apps. I use one called WinGrid. I put in EN34 IT, which is my 6-digit. You put in the other stations and it will tell you bearing and distance. So I know where to aim my antenna. On sideband, it's helpful. You know, VHF contesting typically is not as high strung as HF contesting, like sweepstakes or something. It's generally a little bit more friendly, a little bit more laid back. And so, you know, meet people by their names, you know, check to see how they're doing, what's going on. Short reg chew is not bad. You can kind of gauge that by what's going on. I mean, if you're in the middle of a big 6-meter run, probably not less so. But, you know, if it's the first contact you've worked on 2 meters, it's, you know, 2 in the morning. And, you know, you probably have a few minutes. You could probably exchange some pleasantries. As I mentioned before, do not QSY too quick. So some quick tips for rovers. Rule number 1, be safe. Traffic, weather, power lines, rural county lines are really low. I don't know if you've noticed that or not, but if you're going out there to set up antennas or something, take a look around, see where those power lines are. Years ago, I had a friend who was a rover, doesn't live around here, but he had set up a rover in an area. He was off the road, but it was a high traffic area, and he had gawkers, and gawkers caused an accident, and he felt really bad about that. So just be aware of these things. Be safe, be safe, be safe. Plan your route, share your plan. So I you know, I know where I'm going typically. I'm going down to the St. Charles grid corner, which is, you know, 43, 44, 33, 34. And then I'll share that plan on our email reflector. We some other tools to share that plan so people know where I'm going and about what time I'll be there. If you can, use pre-scouted locations for a rover. I mean, one of the harder parts to do as a rover is to go into strange territory if you don't know where you're going to set up. I often will use like cornfield pullouts, sometimes church parking lots, not on Sundays, schools, sometimes parks, depending on the areas and stuff. Just scout your area if you can ahead of time. It's really helpful if you know where I'm going and I just have to drive there and I'm there. One of the other things I do is as I move around, your bearings to the fixed stations change. So I pre-prepare a list of when I'm in EN33, I know that this station is on this heading, this station's on this heading. I have a cheat sheet. I have all those bearings pre-calculated, so I don't have to figure it out in my head. The less I can do figuring out in my head as I go, the better off I am. So I have all these things listed. I have a list of bearings. On 6 meters, you know, as I mentioned before, 6 meters is a tough band. Dipoles work fine. A 6-meter dipole at 20 feet will outperform a small Yagi at 12 feet. And that's on 6 meters. And that's simply because the height above ground phenomenon, you get that takeoff angle lower. That's sometimes why you see rovers using as high up an antenna as they can. consider power. Are you going to use a battery or a generator? Use fuses. No battle power, as I call it. Put fuses in. I use my car battery right now. I have a lithium battery as well. Some people use generators, but something else to figure out. There's no two rovers alike. As you'll see out in the parking lot, we have two rovers out there, and they're different in how we do things. For Central States VHF Society, we often have 7, 8 rovers show up. No two rovers are alike. Everyone does something a little bit different, but we all get tips and tricks from each other. So consider power, how you're going to do that. Complexity. This is one of my favorites. I like the KISS system. I'm a big fan of KISS. Minimize boxes, minimize cables, minimize interconnects, route things as best you can. I've seen some rovers and it's holy cow. How, if something goes wrong, how do you figure out what's going on? There's, 42 black cables. Keep your cell phone handy for various reasons. And then my important number rule 2 is see rule 1. Be safe. Be safe, be safe, be safe. And then I just had one slide here on EME contesting. There are several through the year. EME contesting is kind of a specialized thing. A lot of people really enjoy it. ARRL sponsors them. Dubus out of Europe, they sponsor contests. And there are some other EME contests around. And one of the really fascinating things about this is that the digital modes have really allowed small stations to participate. Of course, power helps. It used to be, pre, say, 2017, just to pick a number, EME stations, you typically had to have, 4 Yagis and, 500 plus watts, 400 watts, depending upon the band. Pretty big station, kind of some significant engineering challenges there. Nowadays, depending on the band and depending on how you're working, if the other station's big, he can do the heavy lifting. But, stations as small as 1 or 2 Yagis and 50 watts can be EME capable, which is really exciting. The most popular bands for EME right now are 2, 432, and 1296. And there's lots and lots and lots and lots of information on the internet about small station EME. Google small station EME and you'll get a lot of hits on a lot of different things. I've made 1 EME contact. I used 4 1296 loop Yagis running 50 watts, and I worked HB9Q as a big gun on that band. And it was incredible to see the signals and stuff. I was hooked. I'm going to be doing more of that. And then one slide on microwaves. Here's my silent key friend, Tony, working 10 gigs. You can see that's one of the DSS dishes. As we all know, when manufacturers make things, they never make them right. So we always have to repurpose them. So here's a repurpose direct satellite dish that we're using on 10 gigs. And Tony, this is up along the North Shore years ago when we were doing 10 gigahertz across Lake Superior. Which was a lot of fun. His particular setup there is running a couple of watts into that 30-inch dish. I also have a 10 gig system on our table if you want to stop by and look at. It's a smaller system with a 17 dB horn, but kind of the same concepts. Microwave bands, we generally consider 902 and up. The most common bands where you find the most activity are 902, 1296, and of course 10 gig. Line of sight is a myth. Let me tell you, everyone says, oh, you can only work, 14 miles, 10 miles, you got to get on a high roof, so you can see 14 miles. No, that's not true at all. On depending upon propagation and what we're doing and the bands and the power, et cetera, you can work hundreds of kilometers on these microwave bands, which is a real blast. If you're really into weak signal and DXing and playing with radio stuff and, challenges, this is really a fun area, microwaves. And as we mentioned before, contest points go up with higher frequencies. So sometimes making those cues on the microwave bands can give you 4 or 8 points. And there are 3 kind of dedicated contests for microwaves. The 10 gig and up contest, which we talked about, the 222 and up, both of those sponsored by the ARRL. And then, of course, the microwave sprints, which is by Central States. And with that, that's a question, or that's a picture of me. Instead of the first picture was circa 1991, this is circa 2022 or so. See, the car's changed, different color. It's not my Volkswagen Vanagon anymore. And this is down in EN33. This is the Rover that's actually out in the parking lot. And I have this set up for the 222 and up DX challenge. These antennas are 2 and 902, 1296, 20. And 3456, I think. So with that, we have time. I don't know how our time is doing here. Let me check. Couple questions, I guess. Yep. Any questions?
Hey, John, so if you were starting over again in this, what's something you wish you knew going into this?
Great question. I think there could be a couple answers to that question. The one that springs to the top of my head is that, I've been doing this a long time, and consequently, it's kind of like the Frankenstein monster where you add a part every once in a while. And through all the years, I've added all these parts. And so I have stuff, but it's not as well integrated as maybe it could be if I was doing it from the ground up from day one. So, I added a 222 transverter, and then I added this and so on and so forth. So, nowadays, they're the more, depending upon what you want to spend and, what your skill set is, what you want to do, there are modern radios nowadays that are multi-band that can simplify things rather than having one radio for each band or one transverter for each band kind of a thing. That's probably what I would do.
Morning, John. Morning. My question is on the masting when you're going up. Does it interact with the antennas much at all?
Yeah, great question. Rovers are always talking about that question. So the answer changes every day. As you can imagine.
Would it help if you put PVC pipe up and then attached your antenna to
So
that?
it's not so much the mast as the spacing between the antennas. Because one of the problems that you can have is with the close spacing, like I'm showing on that rover, is the tight coupling, particularly on bands that are frequency adjacent, like, 432 is 3 times 144. 902 is an oddball band, so you don't have to worry about that quite as much. But you can get coupling. So when I, for instance, transmit on 2 meters with 100 watts, how much of that power is getting coupled back into my 432 receiver? And am I going to blow the front end of my receiver? Some people solve that by actually having all their radios transmit, even though they're not sending at the same time. So all the radios are going to transmit, even though you're only talking on 2 meters. Other people have filters that are band specific that limit that. I haven't had too much problem with that. I only run about anywhere from 100 watts on 2 and 6 down to like 30, 40 watts on the microwave bands. So that kind of helps too, is that I tend not to run a lot of power. Some of the guys who are running 200, 300, 400 watts and stuff have a little bit more of an issue with that. As far as, the other thing that happens when you bring these antennas close together like that is the patterns aren't as clean as if they had more spacing. But what is not as affected is the gain. They still have gain. So they work well. They just tend not to be as clean a pattern. So like if I rotate, sometimes I'll hear little spikes coming off, I wouldn't hear those if it wasn't mounted with all these other antennas. But sometimes that's not an issue either, because as a rover, if I hear someone off to the side calling me, I want to know about that. So yeah, it's not necessarily a penalty.
Hi, John. Thanks for the great talk. I had a question about safety. Is there any issue with RF safety, particularly if you're running higher power on the microwave bands?
Great question. I'll let you do some research on that and get back to me, would you? I kind of have the same question. So there's two aspects to that question. To answer the part I think you're headed at is I haven't actually looked at the new RF safety guidelines. I've glanced at them, and my general feel is that it's not a problem, but I need to do a more in-depth analysis to make sure that that is indeed true. Again, if you consider that a lot of people are running 50 watts FM on their roof on their car and stuff, it's kind of comparable to what I'm doing here. So I'm not overly concerned about it, but it's a good thing to look at. The other thing is there's so much electronics in cars nowadays. What happens when you hit the transmit button? Does the electronic brakes go off? Does the hatch open and back? When I bought this car, this is a 2016 Subaru, and I put the radios in there. The first thing I did when I did all this stuff is I stood outside the car and I hit the transmit button because I didn't know if the airbag was going off or what. And so I have been fortunate that I have had no issues that way with this. But that's a good question and something to consider with your cars. When you first start to integrate what they call higher power. I've done a little bit of looking to it, different car manufacturers about how they handle those questions about EMI and interference, not only to your radios, but your radios to the car. for mobile systems. And generally Ford had some information there. They generally say anything 100 watts or less is okay. I'm kind of paraphrasing here. And I suspect other manufacturers have the same kind of language, but that would be a good place to go to look up your particular car model. Most of those websites will have information about, you know, if I put a radio in my car, is it okay? I think we're wrapping it up. Yep, good. I'm getting a thumbs up. Thanks everyone for attending. That was fun.